Some wars are loud. Bombs, press conferences, declarations. Other places don't make headlines until they become the front line. When ISIS was surging across borders, I remember scanning maps that most people couldn't even find in a news cycle. Kuwait, Mosul, Fallujah. Not just names, but signals of what is next. And I have learned that in this region, silence is often the loudest warning. Welcome to The Diplomat. I'm Joe Khawli. In this episode, I sit down with Ambassador Douglas Siliman. He led U.S. diplomacy in Iraq, not from a distance, but on the ground, as Mosul was still being fought over block by block. He helped rewire America's mission from warfighting to rebuilding, traveling between Erbil and Baghdad, trying to prevent a civil war. In this episode, we talk about quiet coordination in the Gulf and how diplomacy works when it doesn't make noise, the limits of military victory in Mosul, and the brutal decisions made after liberation. Iran's influence in Iraq and why he chose to say out loud what many only said behind closed doors. What corruption does to hope, and why he thinks the word terrorism should be retired from US vocabulary in Iraq. Ambassador Siliman doesn't speak in slogans. He speaks like someone who has had to explain in real time what happens when a war isn't quite over, but the world moves on anyway. This is The Diplomat, inside the room where power speaks, and this is a conversation you won't hear anywhere else. Let's start with the shockwave that hits a quiet ally when you arrived in Kuwait just as ISIS was rising and exploding across borders. What did you see in that small Gulf state that told you it would play an outsized role in a global coalition?
What I saw when I arrived in Kuwait was a combination of different things. I mean, the United States was very concerned at that point about the conflict in Syria and the growing war inside Syria. And one of my first instructions from President Obama at that point was to try to reduce the amount of money that was coming from the Gulf, and specifically from Kuwait, going into militants who were fighting the Assad regime in Syria. So one of the first goals that I had was to try to convince the Kuwaiti government to try to get better control of the flows of money from Kuwait into Syria. It turns out that this was not as difficult as it might have been, because the Emir at that time, Sheikh Sabah Ahmed al-Rahmo, was also very concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Syria, and would later fund and sponsor 3 international conferences to try to help Syrian refugees and the poor inside Syria. So the Kuwaiti government understood why uncontrolled flows of money collected in mosques or Husseiniya might go to the wrong people in Syria or elsewhere, and made a series of smaller efforts to make sure that the government, the Kuwaiti government, was aware of how the money that was being collected would actually be used, and was going through registered Kuwaiti charities, not simply groups of people from mosques or Husseinias. And I think that was a long-term process, but it was not a particularly difficult one, because the Emir at that time was very concerned about the situation in Syria and wanted to make sure that Kuwait was not in any way doing things or preventing things to happen that would make Syria worse, but was in fact following his desire to help Syrians and Syrian refugees live better lives while the conflict was going on and hopefully being resolved.
So what you saw is, in a way, funneling, not to funnel money and not to channel money to groups in Syria that might be linked to ISIS. That was your
it wasn't even to ISIS. There were a number of Syrian militant groups that advertised themselves in the Gulf as supporting Syrian refugees or supporting the poor in Syria. And they caught the attention of many people who organized charitable events in mosques, or frankly just had a barrel outside the mosque after Friday prayers, where people were encouraged to throw money in to help Syrian refugees. The reality is that many of these groups were actually militant groups that took that money and either made a criminal profit from it or bought weapons and explosives to be better prepared to sort of attack the Assad regime. So it was clear that the free association of individual mosque charitable organizations with people who were not properly vetted in Syria was causing the conflict to worsen because more militants were able to get weapons. This was an idea that the Emir understood, that the Kuwaiti government over time gradually acted against.
How did you gather that advice to share it with them at a time where ISIS was like exploding across borders?
Well, what is interesting is that probably the best information about how money was collected informally through religious networks in the Gulf came not from U.S. intelligence, but from studies by Washington think tanks, where people spent a lot of time on the internet looking at, if you will, the sales pitches from people in Syria who were trying to get donations, religious donations from the Gulf, and then looking at other parts of the same websites and the same individuals, then talking about the weapons that they had bought and the explosives they had bought. The best, most direct information actually came not from a classified source, but from the internet and a number of studies that were done by people in Washington and think tanks.
When weapons linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guard were discovered, Kuwait moved quietly but decisively. What does quiet coordination between the US and Kuwait actually look like when you're trying to stop a smuggling route and keep a war from spilling over?
What we did do quietly behind the scenes is American security officials discussed with Kuwaiti security officials what they had found, what the serial numbers on the weapons told us about the provenance of the weapons, and we were able to, outside of the public eye, come together to decide what Kuwait should do about that and how we could expand our cooperation, again, behind the scenes to ensure that something like this would not happen again in the future. I will note that the discovery of these weapons did increase the amount of concern in the Kuwaiti government for Shia-led violence and the possibility that Iran might have some ill intent toward Kuwait, but that didn't really change the way that the Emir or the Kuwaiti government dealt with Iran. Kuwait had for a long time been an intermediary between other Gulf governments, particularly Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, and Tehran. And the Emir wanted to continue with that role. I suspect some messages of disappointment in the IRGC were sent by Kuwait, but I didn't participate in that appointment. Disappointment, again, it's diplomatic language for don't do that again. We caught you this time, but maybe next time we will not be so lenient. It's a polite message between governments when you're not entirely sure if the entire government agreed to something or a part of the government. And in Iran, there are generally several different factions that operate independently of one another.
You helped commemorate 25 years since Kuwait's liberation. What was said in private during that time between American and Kuwaiti leaders that reminded you history still shapes every diplomatic gesture in the Gulf?
Well, first of all, it seemed to me to be a very strong opportunity to reinvigorate the bilateral ties between the United States and Kuwait. 25 years after liberation is a significant anniversary. The role that the United States played in the liberation was very significant. But when I arrived in Kuwait, I had on my desk 3 Kuwaiti school textbooks, an elementary school textbook, a middle school textbook, and a secondary school textbook. And all of them dealt with the Iraqi invasion and occupation in very, very short sentences or paragraphs. Not one of them mentioned the United States or the United Kingdom or Saudi Arabia, who were the three main actors that ensured that the Iraqi army withdrew from Kuwait. And I said to myself, we need to make sure that the American role, and to a lesser extent the British and Saudi roles in liberating Kuwait, is understood by the new generation of Kuwaitis. If they're not learning about it in their school books, how can we help teach them? So I actually approached the Ministry of Information, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and tried to make sure that we were co-organizing a significant celebration of the liberation of Kuwait. We did a number of events in Kuwaiti schools, and almost all the events were joint events where we had American soldiers who helped liberate Kuwait alongside Kuwaiti soldiers who had also helped to liberate Kuwait or who had stayed behind and ran clandestine operations against the Iraqis. Personally, my wife and I had gotten married just before the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And my father-in-law was a colonel in the U.S. military. He ran an army hospital that helped support the American invasion of Iraq in early 1991. So we had a very personal connection as well to the war because my father-in-law was one of those who crossed the border into Iraq as part of the force that helped liberate Kuwait. So for me, this was a significant event, both in terms of work, but also in terms of my personal life.
You walked into Baghdad in 2016 with Mosul on the brink and ISIS with holding cities. They were in major cities in Iraq. What did it mean to do diplomacy in a place that was still technically a battlefield?
I had never really done diplomacy in a battlefield before, but in the end, it didn't turn out to be very different than normal diplomacy. I came into Iraq at the end of summer of 2016. I had a new sort of military coalition commander who came in at just about the same time. And our predecessors had put together an extensive plan for the liberation of Mosul, which then fell apart because of Iraqi politics. There were concerns from people in the Kurdistan region. There were concerns by minorities in the Nineveh Plains. There were concerns about what roles different Iraqi forces would play. Would the Hashd al-Shabi play any role in liberating Mosul? What would the role of the Peshmerga be? What would the role of soldiers from the south of the country who were neither Sunni nor Christian or Kurdish, most of the people from the area? What would Shia soldiers from the south, how would they be participating in this? And it took some significant negotiations in Baghdad, in Erbil, between the members of the coalition to set the stage for a revised attempt to liberate Mosul. It's also important to realize that very few foreign forces participated in this. Almost everyone who liberated Mosul and later liberated Tel Afar were not American, were not British, were not European. They were Iraqi soldiers. They were Iraqi counterterrorism service. They were from the Hashd al-Shabi. They were from the Kurdish Peshmerga. So it was a matter of the American embassy helping to balance Iraqi politics and making sure that the different armed forces of Iraq coordinated with each other properly and conducted a good operation, which in the end they did.
But you said the kind of diplomacy outside a battlefield, did it not feel different than diplomacy in the battlefield? Was that diplomacy hard or not hard there? Looked like battlefield to you because of what you said, that it was failed because of the Iraqi politics?
Well, I think that it was battlefield politics mostly because we had a deadline that was essentially imposed. We didn't have a date on which the Iraqi army wanted to begin the liberation of Mosul. But we did know that we did not want ISIS to continue occupying Mosul for a day longer than it was possible. So there was an urgency to this diplomacy in a way that you don't always see urgency in a longer-term diplomatic negotiation. this also wasn't a bilateral negotiation. It was not a negotiation between the United States and the government of Iraq. It was the government of Iraq, it was the Iraqi army, it was the counterterrorism service, it was the Peshmerga, it was the Hashd al-Shabi, it was the United Nations, it was the institutions and the countries that provided humanitarian assistance and medical care to the civilians who were in Mosul who tried to flee the battle. And one thing that I will say was new and different about this, we spent a significant amount of time organizing how the battle would be fought in Mosul to permit the largest number of civilians to escape the battle if they wanted to escape the battle. And talking to my colleagues from the United Nations, from other countries and in the military, following the liberation of Mosul, I think the international community and the Iraqi government did a very good job finding, capturing, and getting to medical care and safety and shelter almost every civilian who fled Mosul during the...
You visited Mosul just days after it was liberated. What did that city teach you about the limits of military victory and the harder work that came after?
I think for the first time, I really realized the brutality of war. I had heard these stories of some of the horrific things that ISIS had done to Yazidis or to Shia when they would not agree to live within the ISIS caliphate. What I really wasn't prepared for was the level of destruction in the city of 2 million people. First of all was the conscious destruction of Al-Habba, the mosque and the minaret that symbolized Mosul. This is something that ISIS dynamited and destroyed because they wanted to destroy the heritage of Mosul and the culture of Mosul. They tried to destroy the cultural artifacts in Nineveh. For example, the archaeological sites in the Mosul Museum. They did significant damage to the university. They were trying to destroy the things that were, in many ways, most valuable, that conveyed Iraq's past into the future and tried to help educate Iraqis on what life had been and what life would be in the future in Iraq. The second thing that I found was completely brutal is that it was a very, very difficult battle for the Iraqi soldiers, the counterterrorism service, who were actually going house to house and room to room throughout the city in Mosul. And they made a determination that they were going to reduce the number of Iraqi soldiers who were injured or killed in the battle by simply using military-grade bulldozers. And in the oldest part of the old city of Mosul, where ISIS was most dug in, maybe 200 yards, 200 meters square, they simply bulldozed those buildings on top of the ISIS soldiers and buried them alive to save Iraqi soldiers' lives. One of the things that I will say was maybe most inspiring about the battle, though, is that we heard many, many stories of individual Iraqi soldiers who put their lives in danger to help a child who'd escaped from a house or to get an old woman across the street out of the line of ISIS fire. So this was a battle that has often been compared to the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. But what you had was a sympathetic Iraqi army trying to liberate its people, its population, from an occupier, which was ISIS. So I think those stories I found very inspiring, and it was what carried the Iraqi forces through these very difficult battles. They knew that they were doing something that was good for Iraq and good for the people of Mosul.
You shifted also U.S. policy back then from war fighting to economic rebuilding, and you said ISIS has not been eliminated. How did you convey that message to Washington that it was too early to say this is the finite of ISIS era?
Well, it's actually relatively easy, because you can simply say in communications back to Washington, we have, through assisting the Iraqi armed forces, been able to destroy the vast majority of ISIS soldiers. We've been able to get most of their weapons. We have destroyed most of their command structure, but there is still evidence that there are other smaller pockets out there. You can be very specific in talking to Washington. I conveyed that to the State Department, but people from the U.S. military were also conveying this to the Pentagon, and it was clear that and maybe I should say military victory is never a complete military victory. You never are able to kill or capture the last terrorist or the last soldier from the other side.
Is it because terrorism is an idea that can be planted in anyone's mind at any moment?
Well, it's not even that. It's just that it is almost impossible to eliminate or capture every last soldier of an army that you were fighting. And ISIS acted significantly like an army. And there were a lot of former Saddam military officials who were associated with ISIS and tried to train them as an army. And when you retreat as an army, I mean, ISIS retreated into caves. ISIS retreated into small groups that were able to effectively hide from the Iraqi army, not because the Iraqi army was ineffective, but because it's easy for a group of 4 or 5 people to hide. You cannot hide a brigade or a battalion, but you can hide a small unit. But by doing so, it disconnected the command structure, and it made it harder for ISIS to conduct any real serious and damaging operations. So, I mean, you declare victory when you are certain that your adversary is unable to challenge you militarily, but you still have to be vigilant to make sure that there is not a remnant of that force that can reconstitute itself. And you're seeing that right now in Syria. Whether there are going to be elements of ISIS in El whole camp, elements of ISIS under the custody of the Syrian Democratic Forces, if they were to get out, would they reconstitute themselves as a fighting force, or would they decide that the battle has been lost? We don't know that yet, but there are always elements that escape from the battle.
So what would you say to the risk of claiming the finality of ISIS in Syria too early?
I don't think that you can ever claim the finality of any adversary. But what you can say is we have achieved our goal in that this adversary can no longer conduct the kind of terrorist or military operations that caused the problem.
During the Kurdish referendum crisis, you weren't just a mediator. You were physically moving between Erbil and Baghdad, trying to prevent...
And Sulaymaniyah as well.
And Sulaymaniyah, trying to prevent a civil war. What do you remember most from those shuttle diplomacy moments?
Well, I think I spent most of my time in Baghdad in all 3 of the jobs I did in Baghdad. I was the head of the political section, the deputy chief of mission, the number 2, and then the ambassador. And I spent a lot of my time in Erbil and in Sulaymaniyah because the position of Kurds in Iraq is very important to U.S. policy. They were crucial in helping to draft the Constitution, part of the process. And one of the main goals of U.S. policy since 2003 has been to keep Kurdistan as a productive and mostly integrated part of Iraq with some autonomy. So I spent a lot of time in Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan, all the time that I was there. I probably was in Kurdistan at least every 2 weeks, even when there was no crisis, simply because the relationship was very important. Now, for the period of the referendum, what I found really interesting is the way that Arabs in the South misunderstood the goals of Kurds in the North, the way that the Kurds in the North misunderstood what Arabs in the center or the South were thinking. And one of the things that I did is simply brought views from Basra and Nasiriyah and Baghdad up to Erbil and Sulaymaniyah, and views from Erbil and Sulaymaniyah to Basra and Nasiriyah and Baghdad, because I think that relatively few Arabs ever traveled to the north, except maybe for vacation. There was a time when it was easier to go with your family to the north and have a nice, calm vacation. And very few Kurds traveled to the south, to the Arab part of Iraq. And I felt like I was the ambassador of Kurdistan to Iraq and the ambassador of Iraq to Kurdistan in many cases to try to explain what the possibilities were and how, if the Kurds really wanted to have a referendum on independence, how that could be structured that would cause very little political damage in the south of Iraq. As it turns out, the Kurds conducted the referendum that they wanted to conduct. Many people in the south decided that they took great offense that the Kurds were seeking independence, and because the borders between provinces have historically been very fuzzy in Iraq. Iraqi governments, the royal governments, the government of Saddam Hussein and others have changed so many of the boundaries so many times. There is no established boundary. I mean, the boundary between the United States and Mexico is the Rio Grande River. It's been that way for 150 years, and no one really disputes that. But what is the boundary between Mosul and Erbil? What is the boundary between Salahuddin and Anbar? These are boundaries, even among Sunnis or Shia, which have changed so many times. There are people on different sides of them that have different views. So I thought it was important that somebody could convey messages from Arab Iraqis to Kurdish Iraqis and from Kurdish Iraqis to Arab Iraqis in a relatively unfiltered way.
Did you get that? Did you gather all this after you arrived or before? And how does this important notion get translated to Washington?
I gathered this. I spent 5 years of my career in Baghdad in 3 different jobs. So I gathered a lot of this even before I was assigned there in 2011. I had traveled to Iraq in 2006. And just simply working in the region, you pick up the stories, you understand a little bit of the history. When you're in Iraq and you can talk to anybody, it's much easier to hear the different viewpoints. I mean, Iraq's existence is due to a British-French agreement at the end of World War I, the Sykes-Picot Agreement that divided the Levant and the desert of Syria and Iraq into French spheres of influence and British spheres of influence. So the division of Iraq into a country was because the British wanted to have a monarchy, and they wanted 2 monarchies. So they created one in what was then Transjordan, now Jordan, and a second one in what is Iraq to reward 2 Hashemite sons with significant government positions. The French wanted to have Lebanon and Syria and have that their sphere of influence. So the borders that were drawn don't correspond with ethnic groups. They don't mostly correspond with natural barriers, rivers, or mountain ranges. They are straight lines written,
those divisions,
in the desert.
How much you think hurt the human tapestry in Baghdad? And how in the West we see some of these countries in one brush, painted in one brush?
One of the things that I think I began to realize in my time in Iraq after the defeat of ISIS in Mosul and Tel Afar, when I was able with my wife to travel all over the country. We went to Nasiriyah, we walked on the Ziggurat of Hor, we were in the marshes in southern Iraq, we went in the Nineveh Plain, we visited the tomb of the prophet Nahum, an Old Testament Jewish prophet born in Iraq, died in Iraq, and wrote a book that was incorporated into sort of both Jewish and Christian scripture. Iraq, then if you go back to Mesopotamian history, the number of invasions from the east, from the west, across what is now Iraq and Mesopotamia, the population is not homogeneous. The population has many, many, many antecedents, many different cultures, many different political systems. So Iraq probably was never going to be a unified country with unified ideas.
To probably the point was not to unify it under one idea.
The idea was to unify it under the idea of, I guess you would say, federalism, where different communities, different areas could have enough freedom that they could educate their children, tell them about their religion and their history in a way that made them comfortable, but didn't infringe upon those stories for other parts of Iraq and the upbringing of other Iraqis, which is a very difficult thing to do. I mean, you're seeing problems now in the United States with that, and we are a country that is based on an infusion of many different types of immigrants over hundreds of years. It's difficult to have a society made of different religious, ethnic, linguistic groups work together unless there's a consensus. So the problem in Iraq is to find a political consensus where even the smallest groups are protected and have freedom to do the things that they believe they need to do, but they are part of a larger political and economic whole, which in theory will give all of the groups greater strength and greater prosperity. So that's the vision for Iraq. There is a history of Iraq and a cultural respect for education. Mustansiriya University started in Baghdad 1,200 years ago. The buildings are still there, although the modern buildings are in better shape. There is a lot that Iraq can do if they work together.
The Iran factor, the war next door. You said Iran's political interference was a threat to the very basis of democratic governance in Iraq. What's the cost of saying that so bluntly in Baghdad? And what was the tipping point that made you say this out loud?
It was a conversation that I had throughout all of my 3 tours of duty in Iraq with Iraqi government officials. It was clear that factions within Iraq who were trained, armed, and partially or fully under the instruction of Iranian government institutions were getting more and more power. And that very few Iraqis saw this as a threat, or they were too afraid to push back against it, or they felt that because Shia Iraqis were such a significant part of the population, that they had the right to determine the kind of government. What I learned in Iraq is that most of the Iraqi Shia with whom I spoke believe, rightly or wrongly, that Shiism belongs to Iraq. Najaf and Karbala are in Iraq. And even Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani was born in Iran, but he is the leader of the largest community of Shia Muslims in the world from Najaf. So I think that what I said echoed what I had heard from many, many Iraqis of all political stripes. And because the goal of the United States was to have a strong and independent Iraq, I think I said things like that to try to shock Iraqis into thinking about what I was saying. Why is the United States afraid that this threatens democracy? Why is the United States afraid that Iranian influence is hurting the Iraqi economy? Why is the United States afraid that Iraq will not develop politically or economically the way that many Iraqis would like because of the attempts of people more associated with Iran to control greater parts of governance? So again, it's essentially setting a public stage for a debate among Iraqis.
You said that the young Iraqis or the youth in Iraq are rejecting sectarianism. Now that you're outside government, what would be the one sentence that you would write in the briefing book for the next U.S. ambassador?
Keep reminding Iraqis that Iraq is a strong and wealthy country, but it is the responsibility of Iraqis to keep that wealth and to make Iraq grow and prosper. I think that when I was in Baghdad, in Erbil, in Basra, in Ramadi, in Fallujah, many places expected the United States to make Iraq rich, to invest the money that was needed to reform the country, rebuild roads. The reality is, and I would tell people this quite plainly in private, that the United States just simply does not do that. We don't rebuild countries. We try to set the conditions that permit countries to rebuild themselves. And there are many, many wealthy Iraqis. There's a lot of Iraqi money in London, in Geneva, in Beirut, in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, and other places in the region. But Iraqi businesses are so constrained by corruption, by criminality, by militias and criminal gangs, and just by doubt that Iraq is going to continue to survive as a country, they invest their money outside. And even if it's just buying apartments in Amman, they have not brought the trillions of dinars that are outside the country back to form businesses to help the government create jobs. And I think that American ambassadors need to remind Iraqis, you are a wealthy country. You have human capital, you have water and agricultural land, you have, God has given you oil and gas, and you must use it effectively. And with those gifts, you can turn Iraq into the country that you want to see.
On that note, in 2018, you told Iraqi leaders that you must unlock Iraq's full potential. What do you think is one thing that still holds Iraqi leaders back, and why has it been so resistant to change?
I think the biggest thing that has held not necessarily Iraqi leaders back, but the Iraqi system is the corruption in the system. I think that corruption is the biggest problem in Iraq right now, and it is such a pervasive problem that it goes from the cabinet and the boardrooms of corporations all the way down to soldiers on the street who, at least when I was there, were asking for 1,000 dinars, not very much money, to let a car pass a checkpoint.
And what is one word or one expression that you advise U.S. diplomats to retire from their vocabulary?
I think in Iraq we should stop using terrorism, the word terrorism, because it is no longer really about terrorism. It is about Iraqis organizing their lives together where different communities can make different decisions. So I think that there is a tendency in Washington, because the legal authority to keep a small number of American military forces in Iraq stems from terrorism, legislation that provides the fight against terrorism. It's too easy a word to use. The word needs to be development. Iraq needs to become a strong economy. It needs to become an integrated economy. And most importantly, the Iraqi economy needs to be integrated with the rest of the world.
Thank you for listening to The Diplomat. If this conversation gave you a sharper lens on US policy or made you sit with the weight of what diplomacy really looks like, share it, especially with someone who still thinks of foreign policy as theory, not practice. You can follow the show on every platform like YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And every week, I sit down with the people who don't just understand the map, they have lived inside it. This is The Diplomat, inside the room where power speaks. Until next time.